It's your chance to tell me how you really feel.
It's Friday afternoon. I feel a little tired from all my activity this week, so we won't be too heavy.
Okay. Well, listen. Let me make sure I get. I'm taping you now, and let's make sure I get this right. First, you know what I'm doing, and you're almost the last person I've talked to, except for Fred Eichner himself, but I've talked with sort of people within GSD, a guy called Mark Mulligan, and Guy Nordenson, the structural engineer, to talk about just Japan in general, and then I've talked with all the clients and local Peter Arendt and from Fort Worth and the clients there, and I've talked with Maddie and David, Coolapot, mostly on Fort Worth. I'm trying to, writing the Clark side is going to be the hardest because it's, on the one hand, most complicated, and also there are things that I've, chosen to forget. I had to actually look at the Michael Blackwood movie the other day, which I had seen before it was edited and didn't like it, and I guess I'm a little better with it now. It's out there on Vimeo. I wouldn't suggest it unless you wanted a bit of pain, but it goes from about 2001 or two to much of Stonehill, with the interaction with Annabelle, and and he plays me as the culprit against the great architect and all that. It's there anyway. But it was something that reminded me of some of the worst times. But I guess what I asked of you, if you could remember, because I do forget a lot of the details. I think there are 3 or 4 big things I'd like from you. I mean, one is how you got involved in the project and what your role was at the beginning from your perspective, and then what, and how that may have changed, but I think I can figure that out myself in the recollection. But how this project could have been easier to deal with. What were the biggest challenges in relationship to other projects that or your ideal project? I could fill in the blanks, but I'd love to hear your perspective on that. So yeah, get going.
Well, I'll do my best. So how I got engaged was interesting. It really came through Pete and George, and I was engaged with them on Children's Hospital, and it was really through them that I was introduced.
I remember that now.
Yeah. So that was really a pretty special gift because, here you are, I'm working, on a $1 billion hospital, for the Children's Hospital at the time, and George and Pete was the chairman of the board, I think.
Yep.
At Children's Hospital, and he saw something in me that was important enough that he wanted to introduce me to the Clark.
Yeah.
And I remember flying out there, and I can't exactly remember the details of how that happened, but I remember traveling out there. I remember meeting with you and with Tony, and I think that there became, for you and for me, I think we were meant to be together.
Yeah.
In many ways, because your ambition, your drive, your demanding attention to detail is a lot to satisfy.
Yeah. No. I hear you. And I would just offer. I mean, let me just throw this out there, and I'm moving the timeline a bit. You always were patient. I'm not sure how much I'll say with this. For my sort of understanding of the bigger vision, and you worked with the parties that be to keep that idea alive in spite of any reality check that people might have wanted to put into the process. I think that's, that is a reality, right?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that, sometimes we had a love relationship and sometimes we had a love-hate relationship.
Yeah.
But I think we enabled each other. And I do feel that way. A lot of my success outside of the Clark came through important introductions and really gift-like introductions that you made.
Yeah, and that included, this may not be for publication, but that included the Art Institute of Chicago job because Jim Wood was on the committee, right? And what other thing? There was, of course, Coolapot got involved, and then you moved him to Grand Rapids eventually. What were the other things? I can't remember.
So in that period of time, St. Louis Art Museum, the Harris Theater here in Chicago was going on, the Art Institute of Chicago, Cleveland Museum of Art, the Anchorage Museum, Grand Rapids Art Museum, the Speed Art Museum, and the MFA in Boston.
And all of which, some were more direct than others. I mean, the Art Institute of Chicago was certainly more direct. But, of course, you were Chicago-based, but Jim really saw that, whereas others were a bit more indirect, just a vote of confidence for colleagues that might have asked us how you were. I understand that. But back to our project. So there you were. It must have been 2002 or something. Do you remember at what point we had started? I had done the architectural search, I think. I think we had probably had we picked Ando by the time you arrived?
Oh, yeah, I went with you for the Ando interviews.
Okay.
Had spent quite a bit of time. We flew back and forth together a couple times to Tokyo, and yes, I mean, it was early in your process of wanting to bring together the very best possible that you perceived that was intended to be at the Clark.
Yeah. And you were not part of the interview process, though. You came after that. I think Ando was already on board, and then
I think it was one of the first trips we made together.
Yeah, and then when we started the concept, and then there was a time in 2002 where I was going over every month for about 6 months as we were working on the concept, and you must have come.
A couple times on that.
Yeah. And that was, and there were big engagements. Remind me of something. I remember the big fights that I had with Ando once or twice during those early years, and that was over some redirection in program that I sort of realized once I had left the previous meeting in Japan. I think Coolapot and you did your best to balance the flames. But do you remember one or two of those incidents? I have them in my head, but it was just sort of vaguely.
It's vague, but I think that you and Ando were a pretty tenacious pair. I think. I mean, he very, very embedded in his own style and his vision, and you with, I think, a different and, quite honestly, a broader vision. I mean, the way that you brought landscape and the site into that was not an Ando. That wasn't an Ando. That was you. And Ando was, placing, exceptional buildings in that landscape, but the vision, the big vision, really belonged to you.
And I think and that was Cooper Robertson too. So I mean, earlier on, and yet Ando did, but Ando did make it right in the end with his water feature.
He made it. It was exceptional.
Yeah. I mean, as I look at it, this is again me testing some ideas to you. I mean, my as I look at this project in relationship to both the Ando projects, but any project, because it was a tear down and a build up. with two existing buildings and a complicated program that had to be addressed. That sort of drove me to some of my more difficult position, shall we say? This has to work, and all of that seemed to run counter to what the ease of getting the project done. Is that fair to say?
Oh, it's very fair to say. I think that you really, I mean this in a positive way, you really did stretch the capacity of the organization, yourself, your design team, your program manager, to a limit that was right at the edge of what you could do. And Michael, at the same time, there was love and hate in those moments, but there was never any confusion about the quality of the outcome and the vision. There really wasn't. I mean, that you held, you never wavered on it.
Yeah, interesting. But as you look at, obviously, I mean, I think one of the things that I'm going to have to stress is the complication of the existing buildings, the tear down, the farmer parking lot, the maintenance site. I mean, as you look at this project versus other projects, and from your professional position and in comparison to other museum projects, how big an issue was this? Although I will say in the Cleveland situation, also in St. Louis, we're dealing with a bit of tear down and build up as well. Was this more difficult, or was it just different? Was it more difficult or just different in terms of adding to existing spaces?
I think it was difficult. I think it was difficult because of the length of time you were obligated to take because of raising capital and getting the support of the board and the community.
Yeah.
As opposed to Timothy Rubb, being at the Cleveland Museum of Art and having already the program defined.
Yeah.
And then redefined it. So much different, even though that was a massive program on his side, it wasn't nearly as complicated in the community.
Yeah.
Right? It was a whole different thing. So I always felt that and I think it's very positive. All of the integrated pieces that you brought together, the community, the board, other, architects from Japan, you and that powerful landscape commitment was unique, and it still is. I mean, there are few museums that have the benefit of the attention that went into the site. Yeah. And so the cost related to that time, it related to what, I mean, was the extra cost that we incurred, was that how much was time versus quality program? And the complication of an existing site, or all the above. I think I'm making this up, but it's like a 20% premium. It wasn't a 50% or 100%, but it was, because you were still, I use these words, it's still modest. It's still modest as in terms of the individual buildings. They're very, I'll use a term, they're very sort of, they're very boutique within the framework of the overall site. I mean, there's sort of these boutiques.
So we're talking about, as you talk here, I'm hearing both cost, but I'm also hearing product. When you say boutique or modest, what do you mean by that? Modest in terms of what we attempted to do?
No, modest in terms of the overall scale of the buildings relative to the site.
Mm-hmm.
That there's a certain, it's rich and beautiful, but there's a certain sort of humbleness to the scale.
Mm-hmm.
And
But that's kind of part of the but isn't that a design result as opposed to an actual product? I mean, when it may look modest, the new wing, the new Ando wing, but there's so much underground and there's so much complication below ground. Is that fair to say, or am I?
Yes.
Am I putting words in your mouth?
No, that's exactly right.
So it's modest in terms of the product, but that was conscious,
Absolutely.
and that was more costly in some ways.
It was.
Yeah.
And it took more time. It was more costly. It was, I would say, more thought through. It wasn't. This was not a race.
Yeah. And in fact, if it had been more visible above grade, it would have been cheaper and faster.
Yes.
Possibly. Is that fair to say? I think probably it's true.
Yeah, I think we went through a few of those scenarios.
Yeah.
The answer is yes.
Yeah. The what do you would you say, moving to another, just comparing it to your other projects, particularly with non-U.S. based clients? I guess Chipperfield is one, right?
Yeah.
And what are the special things that Ando required? Well, both positive and negative. As an international architect?
Well, so I think positive is my sense is that the program for the Clark got infused with the benefit of a simple, clean line and around the design. I think that, those were gems. I think Ando's pieces were installation pieces in the landscape.
Yeah.
And were museums and were, facilities for people, but it really was sculpture.
Yeah, and that's that's his quality. I mean, that's what he does.
That's what he does, and he did it brilliantly because the site allowed so much opportunity with the hill.
Yeah.
And the water feature. I mean, that was brilliant, and it was, it also, I think, allowed him, and I'm not going to say I'm, knowledgeable of all of his work, but I think he himself, really was very proud and happy about that outcome. And you really enabled him to do his best work. I mean, and you have so many of us that were involved early in our careers were given what great looks like in terms of ambition.
Yeah. If you compare his style, the working style, though, as opposed to product, Chipperfield and others, you could do Vignoli as well. I mean, anybody. What is the what was different in terms, because that's actually a core of what I'm trying to say.
I can't remember Ando flipping you off and saying "fuck you," and I saw that in a couple other designers out there.
Yeah.
He. So I just think that the cultural subtleties of Ando's presence. There is an elegance there. Part of that elegance is that we don't speak the same language, so there's sort of an elevation in terms of trying to understand the communication.
Yeah.
It's not word. It was never words.
Yeah.
It was drawings. It was emotional relationship.
Yeah.
It wasn't, the Cleveland Museum of Art architect who flipped off the director and said, "Fuck you, I don't have to do this anymore."
Yeah, at times.
Right.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
But he was still U.S. based versus Chipperfield, or did Chipperfield have enough of a U.S. office to actually not need a local architect? I don't even know that.
Yeah, Chipperfield was in that. I mean, we had a local architect of record.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was there was there was not as much. There was. Let me just ask: how might you characterize a difference between Ando's relationship to client in our project versus Chipperfield's relationship to client in if that's possible?
Yeah, it's cultural, isn't it? I mean,
okay.
David Chipperfield is British,
yeah,
and his ego is sitting on his shoulder.
Yeah,
and he's a wonderful architect, but he's not as culturally sensitive, right? He sort of brings his view is that, I mean, it's relatively it's a grid.
Yeah,
it's not. It's got a whole different sense of how it sits on the planet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right? And the Ando, somewhat, the Japanese, the spirituality, the sort of humanity, the humanity piece was so much richer.
Well, what's interesting, as I keep pushing you on one kind of question, you keep coming back to a different question, meaning, which is interesting in terms of your own, meaning you're responding in terms of aesthetics and result. And my questions are actually about process and relationship. Now, I don't know if that's an avoidance.
What's more important is the question.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's not where I'm going. I'm never going to do a compare. I mean, this will be helpful, but it's. I think these are only about Ando projects. So the fact that they're one, I'll never do that comparison. I'm just trying to do a comparison. I did a good conversation with Guy Nordenson in relationship to Taniguchi's MoMA, and the bottom line is Taniguchi will never work in America again. And with a guy called Mark Mulligan, when you go to GSD, by the way, do meet this guy if you ever. I was very impressed. I've not met him in person, but I was put on to him. He teaches there, but he was in Maki's office in Japan for 6 years. Now teaches very sensitive about Japanese practice, and was helpful for me in understanding how buildings are put together in Japan as opposed to what the expectations are in the U.S. But be that as it may. So, and what I'm looking at is for you is a comparison is a process. There's Gensler and Gensler's role. There's you. We had Zabatkin. I mean, it's pretty complicated. We had Annabelle. We had these existing buildings. We had too many phases with this loading dock, separate building, and how it could exist if we didn't have the money to finish the project. I mean, there's just a million, doodaddy things.
There's a million doodaddy things in this one.
and you held it all together for a very long period of time, and having a different role towards the end, as we all remember. But yeah, is there a way that you can summarize difference in challenges as well as process with other projects that you've had in the museum world? You've done it, but I'm just pushing for a bit more, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that my relationship to the work that we did as RISE in the museum world was always, for me, and I had other people, I had Pete Van Dyke and others who were great technical executors.
Yeah.
For me, it was always the relationship with the director and the board, and being a catalyst catalyst for helping making decisions primarily in the commercial side of that investment.
Yeah.
Wanting to bring an expertise that made it possible for the board to look at somebody in the room and say, okay, that's not Michael. This is this other guy, and he's saying that these things should be done. Not only does Michael want all that to be done already, because that's the relationship you and I had, but to be that third voice in the room that took the tension away from the board directly with you.
Yeah, no, there was no question that throughout the project that was deeply necessary, and it allowed the project to to go on. I mean, during the there were many lives of that. The Clark Greylock period when we were doing the enabling building and how much that was going to. I mean, every component, every phase had a different reason for that to be paramount.
Right. And I always felt that in my relationship with you and the Pete's and the Franks and all the board was to enable them to embrace your vision. And my enabling piece was, we can control this. Its value, its reason, without passion, but more analytics.
I will offer this, that when there were regularly budgetary surprises on the upside, your voice allowed them to accept it over time. And there were many such moments.
Yes, there were.
Many such moments, which I could never have done myself. I mean, there's no question about that. And that was a very important role. Do you have any, and I thank you for it as I'm reminded of it, David and Maddie Gensler, any comments about that? They were, as I look at it, they, Gensler as a firm didn't know what they were getting into on the one hand, on the Art Gensler side. And then they performed very well in the course of it. And in performing, they also had the advantage of people like David Adler, who just totally believed in the final product and was willing and subservient in a positive way to all of the Ando wishes. And in a communications world made possible in the latter part of the first decade, they could actually talk, daily about things. So there was drawings back. It was almost like the architect being on site, as close as possible, given the circumstances.
And I
is that right?
Yes, it is. It is right. And I thought it was brilliant the way you were able to utilize Gensler and Maddie, that resource in New York, where key board members were. I mean, you really maximized pretty much everything you did. You touched the board. You were with the architects. You had the program manager. I mean, you really maximized, I think, so much of the resource that allowed you to kind of move that forward. And it sometimes you pushed hard. A lot of times you empowered the people that could do the work that you knew needed to be done, and you trusted. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, it was almost familial in some respect because we were together for so long. But Michael, the amount of energy, and this may not be what you're looking for, but the amount of energy, focus, and commitment that you engaged with, and I'm not making this up, I don't know that any other director of the museum took as much intimate, detailed, and personal commitment into the day-to-day making this happen.
Yeah, well, that's interesting to hear. Yeah, the obviously we had great people, and what I still look at it though, and this is less for this will never get published, but I still look at it as the element of failure too in certain places, not failure in the product, but failure in the processes and the cost. I mean, we spent too much money for this building.
Well, a lot of that was time.
A lot, yeah, and I just it was the time. It was the financial realities. We managed to get Stonehill done before 2008, but then there was 2008, and then we did have to. We were building an institution that had to fundraise in order to see it happen, and and that was a very special. But it's very hard to summarize that that reality. But I can't go back to anything specific other than maybe the Clark Greylock thing. But even then, we're dealing with local communities and who didn't want us to build on our side. I don't know. I can't Monday morning it enough to come up with what we could have done very specially that would have solved this. But it should have cost. What was it? It was in the 200s, right? So
right around 200, 225.
It should have cost 150 or 125. It should have cost 50 or 70 million dollars less, I think.
Yeah.
There was a lot to it in the Manton and the loading dock and Stonehill and all that, but
but time. A lot of that premium came because of the time.
Yeah.
The timing of it, and it just there was we had a national disaster. During that period of time when the bombing in New York City. I mean, there were periods of time that were almost paralyzing in terms of being able to keep the board confident and willing to spend a lot of money.
Yeah.
Really, so it's to navigate those things were year-long impact.
Let me just ask a couple of more things just so I have it down. I think what you said about Genza is right. Do you have anything to mention about? I'm not sure you were all that involved with Annabelle and her work, because that really you had a different relationship with the project once she began to work. Am I right about that?
Annabelle, and I never really engaged with Annabelle because that was being managed separately.
Yeah.
She, in her very charming and lethal way, is quite a capability.
Yeah.
She's both. She's fantastic because she's passionate, and her passion is it's tangible. And whether it's for the art or the moment, you can't really tell. But she's pretty powerful woman, and I thought that was. I think for a number of reasons, having her be engaged opened up a much broader cultural view of what was important in terms of architecture. On the program. I mean, I thought that. That was a brilliant move. I mean, it
added to the complication, but I think it also contributed significantly to a positive
result. It contributed significantly about the overall experience.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
For people who come to the museum.
Any comment about Zbatkins and their roles and how that evolved over time?
Yeah, I think a smart. I mean, I was a little bit put off in terms of what that might have looked like, but the relationship, the smart move about having resources in New York, Andy's style versus Marty. A little of Marty goes a long way. Andy very much, I felt, was a part of the team, and we collaborated really well, and it gave you good value.
Yeah, remind me when they came in after Stonehill or as we were building Stonehill. I'm trying to
As
remember.
we were building.
As we were building.
Yeah.
And we felt, yeah, okay.
I think there was a need. I think there was a real need for their experience to come to bear, and more importantly, the logistics of having them in New York at your elbow and being engaged was real. It was essential.
Yeah.
So and for us, it was. I mean, we still collaborate with them.
Yeah,
I mean,
I know.
You
was
created
another
a relationship. That
it was
is
another
really,
it was another version of the extras that happened out of this project. Our contractors and subs. Did we, from your perspective, did we have a special challenge because of our rural location in terms of contractors and subs?
Yeah. Yes, and I'm not as close to it as Pete Van Dyke would be. I mean, Pete would be able to tell you a whole lot about that. But yeah, I mean, there was moments I think we all felt we were being held hostage by the local contracting organization, and bringing in some of the larger construction groups to participate was worthwhile. I think that was a little rougher than it is when you're sitting in a metropolitan area where you have a different kind of contractor relationship.
And I'm almost finished with this. And Reed Hildebrand's role from your perspective in watching them over time.
I think it was brilliant, and the investment that you made around the discipline and expectations of outcomes for the landscape being as important as the building, which I think is how it's perceived. Big success. Yeah. And them as humans are, they're wonderful to work with.
Yeah. And they ended up like Gensler with a great relationship with Japan.
They did.
Yeah.
They did. Yeah. And I think you got fantastic outcomes from the work they did with you. It's just the landscape piece is.
Well, I mean, it looks. I mean, the thing was solved, right? I mean, in my bringing Yano always mentions this, and you certainly remember my bringing that red granite over to Japan long before. Well, where it was a symbol that I wanted a unified campus. I mean, that's all it symbolized. And then it ended up being, it's as close as possible to looking like it might have actually been done at once, as it could be, given the three, discordant, potentially discordant buildings, right? I mean, am I right?
Yes.
I feel that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, listen, this has been good. Is there?
I have a question for you. How is the Clark doing today?
Well, I will say. Well, here's another way. Let me come back to that in a minute.
Okay.
Because Tony and our internal staff also long suffering. Any comment on how that worked? Because I obviously gave a great deal to both the Lisa Greens and the Tonys and the.
Yes, you did, and well, Tony's ability to navigate with you was really important for us because sometimes we needed to get a voice from Tony on things.
Yeah.
And he would have access to you in a way that we wouldn't have, being a staff member, etc. So, I mean, he was very challenged by the scale and intensity, and he managed that as well as he could, and he was always looking to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Very much for the Clark, but also for us. How can we better, how can we serve better by having Tony's partnership in navigating the Clark organization?
Yeah.
And gee, I mean, I think the world of him, and I'm hoping that he ultimately found or is finding a new place to work, but without him, we would have been much less.
And Lisa, do you have any?
Lisa. I mean, I think Lisa served
the purpose.
Served a purpose. She, relative to the sort of DNA of the team, sort of an outsider.
Yeah.
But you needed a heavy occasionally, and she was prepared to do that, and I think she managed. And you like my observation is that a lot of us grew up and learned a lot on this project. And
I mean, that's a big theme here, and it'll be very hard to express. But it's true. I mean, and we thought of it as during the project too.
Yeah.
I mean, it'll be interesting to try to express that so it doesn't look that it looks real. I mean, but I think I may with Coolapod, obviously you and I don't know everybody, because everybody got engaged in the world of art museums in a different way in the process of dealing with
absolutely.
That kind of thing. The back to the Clark doing. I think it's going through a quieter time. I will say positively that it is. They finished Manton. I mean, will say that was I retired before there was a question of whether they would have the money for the penthouse and things like this. And they basically did all the work for the penthouse. They did all the work for the auditorium, and it looks really nice in the courtyard. I mean, and now they're actually addressing some of the landscape issues. If you think of the pavement on the west side, from Manton going towards the water feature. If you imagine that, Gary had done so many different plans for that, and that's actually going forward. It's still it's being worked on now. So they're addressing it. I think yesterday I was in there. I'm worried about the level of activity to justify the scale that it is. I've wondered whether they should just but I've wondered this even when I was there with Tony, close off the visitor center during the winter time. When there are fewer people, and just use the Manton entrance. I think they might possibly consider that. I think the shows look good there. I mean, but there is the reality that we live with in January, February, of just no one around here. Yesterday I was in there and thinking about the plan that we had made. Do you remember this? For a dining room. Do you remember at the very end we sort of created a schematic for a dining room at some point?
Yes.
I think there's even a special event space wedding site, we're kind of that world out here in the Berkshires. There could be financial justification at some point in the future to actually realize that, because if there's one thing that didn't go right, and I knew it at the time, and I only feel it more strongly, it's food service. Food service never got right in the context of the plan, as it had to deal with the back of house and the art shipments and below grade. And so food service, suffers. And I think whether we had a plan for the penthouse being a dining room, that could happen. I think they could build a dining room, and that could activate it in a special way. Now, that's just me talking. Whether I actually mention it or remind Olivier of it or not, I don't know. He spoke in my class the other day, because I teach at Williams, and he came in. And he's, in the last time he spoke was 10 years ago in that class, so it was nice to see him. I think they're in a. I'm not very close to this, so I'm not sure I'm describing it right. They're in gathering of resources. Period. Not spending a lot of money, and consolidating what they've done in a sense. There's not a lot of programmatic, alteration, shall we say? Then maybe coming back a little. They have done a couple of things. They gave the lease back to MassMocha for that space over there, and that was a decision they made. And I don't know. It's just it's not surprising, any of this, by the way. I mean, this is also what's happening in art museums generally. I mean, there's not a lot of ambition to build except in LA, as you and I talked about this. So it actually fits. It fits both the Clark life cycle, and it fits the reality of the external world at this time. But it never has to be that way forever. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over time. Tony is retiring. He's retiring in August. Bob is actually retired. Bob Nidek. He's coming in a day a week. I have to write to Tony, but because he was the great enabler, right, for me.
He was.
And
so when is Tony retiring? Or has he already?
In August. He'll be 65. Okay. Olivier is a little concerned that a lot of people are leaving, but it's not inappropriate transitions. I think that one of the things that happened, of course, but we haven't seen it. This is very off the record. Is that in the course of finding investors and developing the board, shall we say, in the first decade, we were successful, and we now have significantly resourced people on the board.
That's great.
More than a few, including the board chair and 3 or 4 others. So of a board of 18 or 19, and that was basically an accomplishment of the process of building up the building. So so those people are could be ready to do something if the timing were right. And I think one just has to get through this period of consolidation, and I think the timing will be right for some other kinds of moves, whether it's architectural or programmatic. I can't say, but I think it'll happen. Does that make sense? I mean, that's probably
it does. It does, and so much of that really depends upon the capacity and the passion of the director.
Yeah, and but it's also the time, the times, the times we're in, and the ideas that people have, and I don't know. So so there we are. The point is that Clark has a strong foundation and a beautiful building, and it's ready to do something else. We're all looking. Cool. We're all looking forward to what that else might be. Anyway.
Absolutely.
So, listen, this has been great. Anything?
Well, thank you, Michael, for including me. I love being able to jog things out of my brain and think with you, and I feel blessed.
Well, this has been very helpful, and and I, we'll be in touch, as you know. But this has been helpful for this. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
Yeah, all the best. Bye.
All the best. Bye.